Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little grim. But don't worry, it's not the kind of grim that'll keep you up at night. It's the kind that sounds heavy at first and then quickly melts into a slow, oddly soothing tale of awkward medieval careers, bizarre social rules, and men who spent their entire working lives chopping off heads, only to discover that retirement wasn't exactly a peaceful golden age of gardening and grandchildren. So, dim the lights, settle under your blanket, and let's drift into the weirdly melancholy world of medieval executioners. Now, everyone in the Middle Ages knew about the executioner. He wasn't exactly hard to miss. He was usually the guy with the big axe, or sometimes a sword, depending on the region. His job description was pretty straightforward: end lives, efficiently, on behalf of the king, the city, or whoever had the authority to order such things. It sounds like a position of authority, right? A man trusted with the state's ultimate power. But socially, executioners were a bit like that neighbor who everyone waves at politely, but never actually invites to the barbecue. Executioners were a weird paradox. They were essential but despised. They were protected by law, but shunned in daily life. They were feared and also mocked. In other words, they were the walking embodiment of necessary evil. And that meant when retirement rolled around, things didn't suddenly get easier. But let's slow down a little. Before we talk about retirement, we need to understand the lifestyle of the executioner. Because only when you've lived that odd, ostracized existence does the after-work chapter make sense. The life nobody wanted. First off, nobody grew up saying, "When I'm older, I want to be the executioner." This wasn't a dream job. It was more like a family curse. In many European towns, executioner roles were hereditary. If your father was an executioner, congratulations, so were you. It was less of a profession and more of a generational punishment. And if you didn't inherit the role, well, the other way to become one was to already be socially ruined. Sometimes condemned criminals were spared execution only to be offered the job instead. Essentially, we were going to chop your head off, but how about you start chopping for us instead? Which of course meant that the new executioner wasn't exactly starting out with stellar community reputation. So, right from the beginning, executioners were living in this weird limbo. They were officially employed, often decently paid, and protected by law. But no one wanted to marry their daughters to them. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't sit in church with the rest of the townsfolk. They weren't even supposed to socialize in taverns. Basically, they were the human equivalent of a medieval "do not interact" sign. And yet, bizarrely, people did interact with them. Quietly. Because executioners had a side hustle. When they weren't chopping heads or breaking bones on the wheel, they worked as healers. Yes, you heard that right. Executioners were often trained in anatomy, by necessity, and had access to herbs, oils, and medical knowledge. So if you broke your arm, or needed some slightly shady surgery, or just wanted a poultice made by someone who actually knew what they were doing, you'd sneak over to the executioner's house. But you wouldn't exactly brag about it. So you can see the double life forming. By day, public punishment and death. By night, secret medicine and bone setting. The irony writes itself. Now, retirement wasn't exactly a beach vacation. Let's glide forward. What happened when executioners got old, when their grip on the axe wasn't steady, when their eyesight wasn't sharp enough to guarantee one clean swing? Well, the first thing to understand is that executioners didn't exactly have a standard pension plan. There was no executioner's retirement fund, no cozy countryside villa waiting for them. The closest thing they had to stability was their land or home, if the town had granted it. But socially, they were stuck. After a lifetime of being shunned, no one suddenly opened their arms to embrace old man executioner. The stigma didn't vanish with retirement. In many towns, once an executioner, always an executioner, even if you hung up the axe. Some retired executioners tried to blend back into regular society. They'd shift fully into the healing trade. They'd become the local herbalist, or barber surgeon, or apothecary. But everyone still remembered who they were. Patients would come in, whispering, making sure nobody saw them enter the house. Other executioners simply passed the role on to their sons, whether those sons liked it or not. It was a way to ensure the family still had income, even if it meant condemning another generation to the same half-life of usefulness and disgust. And of course, there were those who didn't retire at all. They worked until they physically couldn't anymore. Because if you didn't have money saved, what else were you going to do? A life in the shadows. To really picture retirement, imagine a man who has lived decades at the edge of society. Every feast, he was excluded. Every wedding, he was unwelcome. Even his children were often bullied and avoided. So when he finally set down the sword, there wasn't exactly a community waiting to embrace him. Many executioners lived out their old age in isolation. Some retreated to farms or houses outside the city walls, where they could live quietly, still offering medical services when people got desperate enough. Others became something like urban legends. Old men in dark houses, avoided by children, whispered about by adults. And yet, there were rare moments of strange respect. A few executioners, if they'd served a long career, could receive small pensions from their city. It was rare, but it happened. Not because people loved them, but because the town recognized that, yes, this person had done society's dirty work, and maybe they deserved at least enough bread and beer to coast into old age. The case of Meister Franz Schmidt. One of the more famous executioners in history was Meister Franz Schmidt, who worked in Nuremberg in the late 1500s. He wasn't medieval, technically, but he's a perfect example of how an executioner's career could end. Franz was meticulous. He kept a diary of his executions, every single one, which is a bit grim bedtime reading, but also incredibly valuable historically. And after decades of working, Franz managed something rare. He successfully retired with honor. In fact, the city even granted him a pension. Why? Well, he had two things going for him. One, he was extremely professional. He didn't botch executions, which townspeople hated. And two, he was a respected healer. By the time he retired, he was more famous for his medical skills than for his executions. In the end, people respected him enough to let him fade into comfortable obscurity. But the Franz was the exception. For most executioners, retirement was less honor and pension and more fade quietly into a corner and hope people don't throw rocks at your house. Shunned even in death. Now, here's the saddest part. Retirement didn't even fix things in death. Executioners weren't allowed to be buried in regular churchyards. Their graves were often set apart, sometimes outside the town walls. So even in death, they were separated from their communities. Imagine working your whole life for the town, enforcing its laws, doing its darkest work, and then not even being allowed to rest in the same cemetery as your neighbors. It's a strangely lonely fate. And that, in a slow, drifting way, is the picture we're painting tonight. A man who lived in shadows, provided a service everyone needed but nobody respected, and retired into the same quiet obscurity that had always followed him. But don't worry, we're not done. In the next section, we'll float deeper into some specific examples. We'll wander into France, into Germany, into England. We'll meet some executioners who botched their retirements, some who reinvented themselves, and some who proved that once you've been the man with the axe, you can never really escape it. Executioners weren't just faceless hooded figures. Some left behind journals. Some got famous, or infamous. And their retirements give us little snapshots of how the job twisted their lives. Franz Schmidt, the reluctant celebrity. Let's start in Nuremberg, Germany, around the late 1500s. Franz Schmidt. The man was basically the LeBron James of executioners, if LeBron kept a diary about every dunk, free throw, and twisted ankle he ever handled. Schmidt's father had been forced into the profession by a prince, literally grabbed at random and told, "Congrats, you're the new executioner." Franz inherited the role, no choice in the matter. For 45 years, Schmidt executed more than 350 people and flogged, branded, or maimed hundreds more. And he wrote it all down, every detail. Cold, clinical, neat handwriting. But here's the twist. Franz didn't think of himself as a monster. He thought of himself as a professional. And when he retired, he didn't vanish into exile like most executioners. Instead, he became a healer. The same hands that tightened ropes and swung swords now set broken bones, treated tumors, and prescribed herbs. And people actually came to him, willingly. Nuremberg even granted him something unheard of, full legal respectability. His children could marry whomever they liked. His family name was cleansed. Franz Schmidt, the man who had spent his life as a social pariah, retired as a respected town elder. It's almost wholesome. Almost, if you ignore the 350 corpses. Jack Ketch, the punchline that wouldn't die. Now let's hop to England in the 1600s. Jack Ketch. His name became so infamous that even centuries later, people used it as slang for botched job. Why? Because Ketch was terrible at his work. Executioners were supposed to make a clean, quick strike. But Ketch? He had a habit of hacking like a drunk carpenter with a dull saw. In 1685, he botched the beheading of James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. It took multiple strikes, the crowd was horrified, some had to look away. Ketch became a national joke, cruel, clumsy, the ultimate figure of shame. And his retirement? Forget peaceful gardens or healing clinics. Ketch never escaped his reputation. He became a punchline in plays, pamphlets, and street gossip. When he died, no one softened the story. He was remembered as the bungler. If Schmidt was remembered with respect, Ketch was remembered with ridicule. Two sides of the same X. Charles Henry Sanson, the gentleman with the guillotine. Fast forward to France in the late 1700s. Charles Henry Sanson, the man who executed more than 3,000 people, including one especially famous royal, Louis XVI. Sanson wasn't a shadowy figure skulking on the edges of society. He dressed like a gentleman, he had servants, he lived in Paris, not some lonely cottage. During the French Revolution, he became a grim sort of celebrity. But retirement didn't mean peace for Sanson. After decades of guillotine duty, he tried to live quietly, but his name haunted him. He published memoirs, or rather his family did, which became bestsellers, though heavily embellished. Even in retirement, he wasn't allowed to be forgotten. Unlike Franz Schmidt, who found respect, or Ketch, who found shame, Sanson became something else, a cultural character, a man transformed into ink and paper, stage plays, and scandals. In a sense, his retirement never really began. The outliers. Not every executioner had these dramatic stories. Most slipped away quietly. They gardened, they healed, they tried not to get stoned in the marketplace. But Schmidt, Ketch, Sanson, these men remind us of the extremes. Some went out respected, some ridiculed, some immortalized in books. And all of them show us just how strange retirement could be when your career revolved around swinging steel over kneeling necks. The gentle drift. So here's where we are. Executioners didn't all vanish into obscurity. Some became healers, some became legends, some became jokes. But whether they were remembered with awe, shame, or reluctant respect, their retirements tell us this much. Society never really let them go. Even in old age, even after the last axe was hung up, they still carried the weight of their profession. It followed them like a shadow. And centuries later, here we are, still talking about them. When you picture an executioner, you probably see the usual European stereotype: hood, axe, medieval vibes. But around the world, societies had their own specialists. And just like in Europe, these men often carried the same paradox, both needed and despised. Let's drift through a few of them. The Ottoman Bostanji, gardeners with rope. In the Ottoman Empire, executioners often came from the Bostanji Corps. Bostanji literally means gardener. Yes, the Sultan's gardeners also doubled as stranglers because, well, efficiency, I guess. When a prince or a vizier fell out of favor, the Sultan would summon the Bostanji. They'd strangle the condemned with a silken bowstring. Neat, quiet, no blood. Very practical for palace courtyards that doubled as tulip gardens. But here's the odd part. Since they were already part of the Sultan's service corps, their retirement wasn't like Europe's outcast executioners. Instead, they often just, well, went back to being gardeners. Imagine strangling a vizier in the morning and trimming roses in the afternoon. A bizarre work-life balance, but strangely normalized. And when they retired, they were usually granted pensions as loyal palace servants. No exile, no pariah status. Just a quiet life, perhaps sipping coffee under the same trees where they once carried out a sultan's command. Grim multitasking, but strangely normalized. Japan. The samurai headsman. In feudal Japan, executions were sometimes handled by samurai retainers, especially beheadings with the katana. And here, the role had a slightly different flavor. It wasn't considered as shameful as in Europe. Why? Because for samurai, precision swordsmanship was an art form. Executing a criminal, or assisting in seppuku, ritual suicide, was seen as an honorable duty. The executioner was supposed to deliver a clean, single stroke. Nothing less was considered a personal embarrassment. Now, retirement for such men, well, because their execution work was just one duty among many, it didn't define them. A samurai might serve his lord, execute executions when ordered, and then retire into the usual path, teaching swordsmanship, running a small estate, or simply becoming a monk. Execution wasn't a lifelong stigma here. It was, well, just another grim task in the samurai job description. China. The professional headsman. In imperial China, the state employed full-time executioners. Beheadings, stranglings, death by 1,000 cuts all fell under their grisly portfolio. Executioners here had reputations similar to Europe's, feared, shunned, and sometimes believed to carry bad luck. Many Chinese executioners passed their craft down through families. Sons inherited the profession, whether they wanted to or not. And retirement, well, much like Europe, it could be lonely. Executioners were often barred from marrying into respectable families, so even after retirement, their descendants carried the stigma. But some executioners leaned into it. They developed reputations as martial arts experts. Others sold souvenirs, blades, ropes, even clothing from their executions. Morbid side hustles. And a few became folklore figures, remembered almost like boogeymen. India, caste and the hangman. In parts of India, under both pre-colonial and later colonial systems, executioners were often drawn from specific low-caste communities. They didn't choose the job, it was hereditary, linked to caste duty. Unlike in Europe, where an executioner might eventually wriggle out of his profession, here the social boundaries were stricter. Retirement didn't mean freedom. It meant your children and their children would likely inherit the same grim task. Even in the 19th and 20th centuries under British rule, certain families carried on the role. Some still do today. The stigma lingers. Retired or not, hangman families are often treated as social outcasts. So while Franz Schmidt in Germany could reinvent himself as a healer, many Indian executioners had no such escape. Their retirement was simply a pause before the next generation took over. The quiet thread. So across cultures, we see the same quiet irony. Executioners could be gardeners, warriors, state officials, or caste-bound laborers. But retirement never looked entirely normal. Some faded into gardens, some taught swordsmanship, some left behind haunted family legacies. It seems universal. When your career revolves around death, you don't just clock out and blend back in. Your past hangs over you like a shadow, whether you're trimming tulips in Istanbul or brewing tea in Edo. So what really happened to medieval executioners after they retired? The short answer